You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. My next guest is Dr. Ivan Kurilla. Dr. Kurilla is a professor at European University in Saint Petersburg and a specialist both on history and on American-Russian relations. Dr. Kurilla, Russia is frequently referred to as a country with unpredictable past. What does that expression mean to you? And in general, how does Russia address its deep political problems?
When somebody wants to go public and to speak about the deep political problems, he starts by speaking about the old Russian history. And that's why we still have unresolved problems with a deep historical past. We still frame our political disagreements in a historical argument about Ivan the Terrible, of course, about Joseph Stalin, about Mikhail Gorbachev and Perestroika, about the 1990s, about the past as deep as Prince Vladimir of the 10th century AD, and it's still there, it's still here, because this is the only available language to speak about the political disagreements. And that's why we have an unpredictable past, because the past in such arguments is a function of the present, because the past in these disputes and these arguments is always a result of contemporary projections. And that's why we continue, that's why we live in such a country. As a historian, I may be both disappointed and very interested to wait for another politician to speak something about the past, and it's always a rich material to analyze. But for the country, for the public discourse, it's actually really pity situation, because we need to develop the different language to speak about the politics. We need to develop language that is not just speak about the past, but the language about the future, language about the values, ideals, and that is actually what we lack.
All right, there's been several things, Dr. Kurilla, that you've hit on. So, well, I guess first to look at the scale to which the history can change. I think, as you started in the beginning, every generation rewrites history a little bit and makes adjustments and learns more, and historical figures perhaps emerge more complex and perhaps interesting. And, although it seems like certain things, like, I'm looking at the United States, certain administrations seems to kind of change depending on who is in power at the time, looking back, and how history has played out. There's a lot of factors. But in Russia, the difference can be rather drastic between how we view a certain leader now, or in 5 years, or in 10 years. And it doesn't even depend necessarily on a new person being in power or being in charge. There's just, it seems like these winds are blowing, and how do these changes even occur? Is it a matter of a new political leader coming out, not even new, but another one coming out and saying something different, and all of a sudden all the books need to be rewritten? Or is there bigger waves that are at play? What moves these tectonic shifts so swiftly across Russian historical landscape?
Okay, let me start with, I will try to distinguish between two different problems, because I was probably not clear enough. I will try to say first, for professional historians, this is also the situation that can be called rewriting the history, but I will first explain what I meant here. History as a scholarship, history as an academic field is always a dialogue. It's a dialogue between the contemporary societies and the societies of the past. And this is a dialogue where we ask the questions and the past gives us the answers. And this dialogue is definitely changing because the contemporary societies are changing, and because the new generation has their own questions to ask to the past, and the historians are interested in different problems or maybe of the same events, but they ask different questions to the same events. And this is good. This is how the historical science or history as art and academic field is developing, with the new questions being asked and new books written about. You know how many books were written about the French Revolution or about the Russian revolutions of 1917. It's already thousands, and will be more for them in the future. But what you're asking actually not about the history as academic field, but history as a public discourse and history as politicians use it. And this is a bit different problem, a different situation. And this is about the so-called historical narratives, historical narrations, which is included in the school history textbooks, which is included in the public memorials and included in the public speeches of political leaders. And this history is rewritten. This school textbooks is being changed constantly, and this is bad. This is not about the scholarship. This is not about academic questions which are changing. This is about the view on the history as a political tool.
I guess I'm also going back to some of those old Soviet encyclopedias that were published during Stalin's time, where those that were holding them would get like letters or some kind of notifications saying that now please rip out page 35 and rip out the picture on page 47. That kind of
exactly.
control.
This is more like Orwellian attitude to the past, when you can change the past as soon as today's situation has been changed. But we have a very drastic changes even in the history textbooks. We have I don't know if you of course your listeners do not know, but we had during the whole Soviet and even post-Soviet period, we had one of the high points of the Russian history, pre-revolutionary 19th century Russian history, the Decemberist rebellion. It was the first attempt of Russian liberal-minded nobility to change the way the Russia is ruled, and they raised a rebellion in December of 1825. And the rebellion was smashed. Several people were executed. Tens, hundreds were sent to Siberia. So that was a very important part of the Russian event in Russian history, and we always remember it with veneration, with deep esteem to the first liberal attempt, to get rid of autocracy, to change the Russian state into more, if not democratic, fully democratic, but at least less autocratic way of rule. And recently,
I will just jump in there quickly for a reference point. There's a well-known band, the Decemberists, and I just looked it up. They actually did use the Russian Decemberists as the reason for their name. So there's one way to promote history.
And why talking about this, just because we have a very clear anti-revolutionary turn in Russian politics, which started, I guess, after the events in Ukraine 12 years ago, in the so-called Orange Revolution of 2004. And after that, we get even school textbooks which describe Decembrists and the dangerous plotters, those who wanted to sink Russia in blood, and with very different, drastic change of the long cherished view on Decembrists
So are the Decemberists of 1821 are good now, or are they bad
in
now?
some, this is a change. There are some textbooks, and maybe still majority, which continue to describe it as a noble cause, their ideas as a noble cause. But there is also at least one textbook which describes them as a very dangerous people who wanted to only bad to Russia. So this anti-revolutionary trend in the current Russian policies is projected into the textbooks and projected into explaining what happening with Russia. And
So another way, if the current government is afraid of revolution, then any revolutionary of the past is bad.
Exactly. This is what they wanted to do. That's why it's very interesting. We're still waiting for, next year will be the centennial of Russian Revolution of 1917. And we all are waiting what will be said by their political leaders for that celebration, because it's a very hard choice. On the one hand, the current regime is very anti-revolutionary, openly anti-revolutionary, but on the other hand, 1917 was an important event which made legitimacy to the whole succession of people after them, the whole state. Now, even after 1991, the whole Russian state still inherited many of its features to the 1917 events. So we will see how President Putin and his advisors, historical advisors, like Minister of Culture Medinsky, will set that problem. But generally the regime uses the history not as an academic field. They use it as a propaganda tool. And I just mentioned Medinsky. He is Minister of Culture and also the head of Russian Society for Military History and one of the major open spokesperson about the historical politics. And he repeatedly said that history is not a scholarship. History should be a useful myth. And if the myth is not, if the myth is dangerous or detrimental to Russian interest, so historians should not develop that part of scholarship. They're not, and this is a very anti-historical, I would say. Historians are.
I would almost have to disagree with you, only because what I'm hearing in this is that what Secretary Minister Medinsky is saying to me is that he's acknowledging the importance of history and how dangerous it is and how careful we have to be with it.
Yeah, in his own way. But he wants to solve that. Well, he sees a danger in history, and how he wants to solve that danger is just to prohibit historians to do certain things. He just openly said, I remember I presented in some of the conferences that Medinsky also attended, and Medinsky said, if you or Russian historians will discover something in the documents that say, for instance, that Kuril Islands should belong to Japan, of course you should hide it. You should be on the interest of the state. Of course you should not develop this investigation further. And this is very anti-historical, very anti-scientific, I would say. Very and this is.
But I think this is what passes in today's Russia for patriotism.
Yes, this is how they understand patriotism. But I would disagree.
But it's a different conversation. Let's reset this and take a look a little bit more at the exciting Russian history, which it continues to excite Russia to this day. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Yuri Rashkin, and this is Rashkin Report. My guest today is Professor Dr. Ivan Kurilla, who is a professor at European University at Saint Petersburg in Russia. And we're speaking about the excitement of Russian history. As you mentioned, next year is going to be a 100-year anniversary of Soviet Revolution, and the position of Vladimir Lenin has never, I think, seemed more uncertain, because Vladimir Putin seems to come out with comments against, critical of Lenin, and so people are wondering what consequences will this have. Will the mausoleum finally get rid of its, permanent resident, or what's going to happen? How do you see Lenin's place in today's Russia?
Yeah, this is very interesting question. When I grew up, when it was still the Soviet Union, And Lenin was considered to be the founder of the state and much more important figure than, for instance, Stalin. And if you look on the historical discourse in Russia now, Lenin is so secondary figure compared to Stalin that the 20th century Russian history is focused on the Stalin much more than it used to be focused early on Lenin. So Lenin's role and Lenin's importance in Russian history in the public view, in the public appreciation, decreased significantly. And now this is not as important figure as it used to be. And that's why we will see what will happen in 2017 and 2017, and maybe when this some decision about mausoleum will be taken. But on the other hand, from my point of view, the President Putin is from the very beginning he was very attentive to the symbolic part of politics. He was very attentive to historical politics. He used important events of Russian history, especially the Second World War, Great Patriotic War in Russian understanding. He used it constantly in his speeches, in his public appearance. So it was very important. The symbolic part of the politics was very important for him. And from this point of view, during taking Lenin's body from mausoleum and burying somewhere in the cemetery is a very important symbolic step. It's the change. Any change in these great symbols we inherited from the 20th century is itself very, very important symbolic step. So it is possible, but it is possible only on the condition that a current regime will need to do something very important symbolically. It may be the crisis. If there is a way to divert public attention from crisis, it may be the diversion from economic hardship to symbolic arguments. We had several very clear examples of this diverting of the public attention from corruption, from economic hardship to symbolic things recently, especially after 2012. But mausoleum and Lenin's body fate is something very important. And if it will be, any decision will be taken, any change will be taken, it will immediately produce a huge argument and clashes between communist or pro-communist part of Russian society, or those who still believe in the importance of Lenin and mausoleum, and those who will say that, well, this is a good thing to do. And this type of symbolic gesture. I don't think that regime will waste it just for a symbolism. It will be taken at the moment when anything. When the public attitude to the regime will be dangerous for it, and at least this is my prediction. We will see how it will develop, but this is my take on this question.
So, should we see something happen? That is definitely a sign of big things happening.
Exactly.
All right. Let me ask you this, since it's I consider an opportunity to speak to a specialist in Russian history. There's a rumor, myth, legend, I don't even know how to describe it, that the reason that Lenin is in mausoleum in the first place is because Stalin, just wanted to get back at him and wouldn't bury his body. Is there any truth to that from your historical perspective, or is this just kind of a old wives' tale kind of a thing?
Okay. Well, actually, I'm not a historian of that particular part of the Russian history, and so I cannot neither support this this story.
You cannot put this to rest,
neither I can deny it. So it was just not my field. I did not see the documents or any memoirs about that. Maybe not. But well, if I don't think it's that actually story is really important. It's more like a historical anecdote. It's a lot of stories which are interesting, but which do not change our understanding or our take on this or that event in our history. Yeah.
All right. The relationship between Russia and United States is in such a it's just a mess right now. It doesn't sound like America is interested. America, especially during the presidential campaign, is mostly using Russia as a punching bag, and Russia seems to be playing its own game. Can this situation ever get fixed? Or is it just a matter of until Putin is gone, it's going to be a mess?
Well, okay, both. Yes on both questions. Okay, let me say this is again interesting. Another interesting question. I consider myself as a historian of Russian-American relations, constructivist. Well, this is a methodology which explains the mutual image construction of two societies, of two countries, how Americans look into Russia and how Russians look in America, as a mostly result of the internal political struggle. Of course, the other country provide some basis for one or another image construction, but usually any country, including Russia and including the United States, provide a very broad spectrum of its own images. But it's about the other country, another society, which make a choice which is important and what is important and what is not. And from this point of view, you're very right when you say that the presidential campaign is just a very, very clear example how Americans are using Russia as you said, a punching bag. It's always like that, and it's used to be. If you remember, like previous presidential campaign when Mitt Romney said that Russia was a major geopolitical force of the United States, it was said actually before Ukrainian events, before Crimea. So it was still in the situation when the relations between Russia and the United States were relatively good. Why Mitt Romney said it? Not because he wanted to say anything about Russia, not because he actually was thinking about Russia a lot. He wanted to punch his major rival, President Obama. And for Obama, the reset policy, some type of rapprochement between Russia and the United States was one of the major achievements of his first presidential term. That's why Mitt Romney wanted to punch President Obama, but he did it by saying that Russia was a geopolitical force, and this is how the image of the other country is developing. Let me then ask you. Russians and Americans are using the other country as a tool in the internal political struggle, but as a byproduct of this internal political struggle, we receive these images of the other country, and unfortunately, for a long time, both Russia and the United States uses the other country as a scarecrow much more than it's deserve. Both of us deserve.
That's a fascinating point because it basically, it makes sense because, whether it's Mitt Romney or Barack Obama or any presidential candidate, they're concerned about obtaining power in this country. And so they're going to say what the electorate of this country wants to hear, versus they're less concerned about what impression they're going to make on the Russian population, for instance, or even Vladimir Putin. They're concerned about winning the next primary.
Well, I can give you an example. Well, not totally symmetrical, but still to the same point about Russian side. We are now in the situation of the very high anti-American feelings here in Russia, and there are two major factors to my mind what that contributed to this anti-Americanism. And the first factor is actually governmental propaganda. and why the government was so clearly anti-American, and actually they became so openly and fiercely, I would say, anti-American quite recently. Again, well, some will say it started in Munich speech in 2007, but mostly it's again after 2012. All of this anti-Americanism in state propaganda. And why? Just because, that was a threat to the regime. The protest after the elections of 2011 and 2012, the Duma and presidential elections, it was a time of when many Russians went to protest the rigged or fraudulent elections. And actually, that was a real threat to the current regime. And what the regime wanted to say, it wanted to alienate those who protested. It wanted to alienate people, part of the Russian people, who did not like this type of political regime, this growing authoritarianism, and how to do it. There was a very simple, mechanism, but that includes two parts of it. First, you should say that all those who protested are somehow connected to the United States. They either connected by, travels, by grants, by sympathies, by whatever. And the other part of it, you should also portray the United States as a country which always plotting to destroy Russia, to destroy all the Russian ability to survive in the current world. So both factors should be present, and that's why anti-Americanism can be understood as an attempt, as a part of the attempt to alienate protesters within Russia. But this is only one factor of the current regime. But on the other hand, this factor is nothing new. We had, if you look back in the Russian history, you will see each time when Russian government, Russian state decided that the major goal of the state is to keep stability, to freeze popular movements, or to stop unrest. Every time it was during late Stalin regime, it was during late Nicholas I regime, it was during late Brezhnev era. Every time the United States appeared as a threat, as something that can be dangerous, and Russian state propaganda started to portray the United States as a plotters, as somebody very, very un-Russian, very anti-Russian. But on the other hand, every time when the Russian state decided that there is a time to reform, there is a time to modernization, there is even limited modernization, if they can understood the modernization only in technical terms, like to build new industry. But every time, again, during Nicholas I, during Bolsheviks in the 20th and early 30s of the 20th century, during Khrushchev, Gorbachev, and all the reformers, and even during short presidency of Dmitry Medvedev. And every time when the Russian state proclaimed modernization as its goal, the relation of the Russian state to the United States turned to be positive. Every time they traveled, invited American engineers, traveled to America, brought iPhones or corn or whatever, or steam ships or locomotives in the 19th century. But every time, and this is a cyclic development. Now we are in that's part of the cycle which produces anti-Americanism. But this is not the end. This is not the end. The cycle will change, and eventually some Russian government will turn again to modernization, to reformist, probably somebody after Putin. But I will not exclude that even Putin, under some condition, will want to get back to reforms because of the economic problems, because of the hardship. And so I will not totally exclude that even Putin will get back and to change the policies, which is of course not very probable, but still not excluded very end.
All right, Professor Kurilla, then how flexible do you feel Vladimir Putin is on his policy at all? Is there any non-negotiables, or is he just kind of waiting for the right deal to make a deal on anything, whether it's Lenin's body or
I'm sure he can make a deal, and probably he is, but he is now in the situation. This is he is under sanctions, and Russia under sanctions, and I don't see how how it can be lifted, how the sanctions can be lifted, because I don't see Putin getting back with a decision about Crimea, for instance, and that is a major problem which produces sanctions. So from this point of view, he is not flexible to get back, but he's flexible on any other front, I think, and this is why he may make a deal on. Probably he is. I can guess. I don't know exactly, but I can guess that his hopes now in the American political sphere to get somebody much less institutionalized into White House, somebody who will be ready to make deals on his own side, not to, because any president of the United States has a lot of checks and balances, and institutionally, any president of the United States will be, prevented from making a, big deal with Russia and returning to the normality without Russia getting back Crimea. But if there is somebody who is much less institutionalized, much less confined by checks of the whole institutional culture of the United States, this is somebody who is Mr. Putin will want to make deal with. And he's personally, on the personal basis, he can produce a good impression. And we all remember when President George W. Bush said that he looked in his eyes and found the soul there. So this is a way how he communicates on the personal level. So he will try to get the next president of the United States and to meet him and to convince to make a deal with him. Probably this is one of his hopes. But okay, this is my fantasy, of course. I do not know exactly what he's thinking, but this is my take, my impression of how he.
Well, it makes sense because himself, Putin, is fairly unrestricted in what he can do. And so he just needs, I suppose, a partner who is also unrestricted by whether it's checks and balances or morals or ethics or whatever. And that will allow a deal to be made. Do you feel that throughout history in the last whatever period of time we can reasonably discuss here, it's been the relationship between Russia, whether it's Soviet Union or Russian Federation, with America has been better, for whatever that means, under a Republican administration or Democratic administration? Or how has the relationship with Russia, from your point of view, has been affected by whether there's Democrats in the White House or Republicans?
Okay, this is difficult because from the point of view of Russian ruling elites during the late Soviet period and during post-Soviet times, it's a kind of proverbial truth already that Republicans are easier to deal. Because mostly what it's Russian elites view on Republicans are more close to realpolitik. They are ready to make deals. They're ready to recognize that there is nothing important or nothing that America can change into Russian internal or Soviet back in the 70s internal politics. So Republicans are easier to speak about their world affairs, about the international orders, and Republicans are more, much more ready to discuss that without interfering into Russian internal problems. And from that point of view, Republicans traditionally, at least this is a tradition since probably Richard Nixon. I will not go further back. But yeah, from Richard Nixon, it was a tradition. But on the other hand, if you think about the Russian national interest in the wider perspective, you will see that probably many in Russia will support democratic candidates, or traditionally would support Democrats who always were much more concerned about the internal conditions of Russia, Russian drive into democracy or vice versa to autocracy. And that was with Jimmy Carter, who was concerned about dissidents in Russia. It was with current administration, which also was always tried to continue its double track, continue to discuss some problems with Russian opposition, and that's actually always a problem for Russian government. The Russian government does not know what to do with this, democratic attention to what is going on inside Russia. And from that point of view, Democrats are more difficult partners for the Russian government. But again, if I would speak only for Russian government, Democrats are better. If I speak for Russia as a whole, I'm not so sure.
All right, you mean for the Russian government, you mean Republicans
for the
are
Russian
better?
government, Republicans are better. But yeah,
Right.
for the Russia, not sure.
Okay. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Yuri Rashkin, and you're listening to Rashkin Report. My guest is Ivan Kurilla, who is a professor at European University in Saint Petersburg in Russia. And here's the kind of the interesting issue that I see is that on one hand, Russian leaders distrust democracy, I think, because they see it as a way for some nefarious players to enter the field and under disguise of people's choice try to create some, just overthrow the old government and introduce new government of the same oligarchs. Because I think Russian government just sees power as, that's how it is. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, you're saying that when they look at Obama, let's say, or any Democrat, they don't know necessarily what to do with them because they don't play by the same rules quite as much because they like to follow laws and they care about ethics and such. How do Russian government can possibly square it away that it's kind of neither or?
Well, for Russian government, again, this is my understanding. Of course, I am not a member of Russian government, so I speak how I see them and how I see the way of thinking. For them, it would be easier if American president would only behave as a 19th century leaders who were concerned only about power distribution, about the and international law as just a result of the power calculations. And everything which is of different international tradition, which goes to international law, international organizations, even organizations, despite the fact that Russia is still cherish United Nations as a very important tool of Russian foreign policy, but international law in general is much less important for the Russian rulers, and they do not. From this point of view, if you look in the world in this 19th century framework, you will think that everything which is not about power is just a propaganda, and even democracy is just a propaganda, and even the spread of free societies is just a tool of so-called soft power, which finally leads to the same result, to the domination of the United States in the world arena. And from that point of view, this is a global mistrust or global cynicism of Russian government. Actually, I think that they really do not believe in democracy or do not believe that American spread of democracy is genuine. It's something that they're so cynical in their internal politics, they are also cynical about foreign politics. And unfortunately, the Western leaders, did produce, in many instances, produced this impression. They were ready to deal with Russia when Russia was rich, even in the expense of, I would not tell you the examples, but some of European leaders, who were ready to work with Russia, or international organizations who were ready to work with Russia when Russia was rich, despite all of these problems with democracy, with whatever. So this was one of the arguments that Russian government are.
Do you feel that this kind of attitude is something that is related to just one person, or is it an underlying issue in the sense that almost no matter who's going to replace Putin, it's going to be the same not trusting approach? cynical approach.
No, on the one hand, I don't think that's the only person, that everything in the government is just one person. We are very autocracy, personalistic autocracy on the one hand, but there are still some people around Putin who continue, who reinforce those attitudes of cynicism. And actually the cynicism is already widespread in the Russian society as a whole. Unfortunately, if you look back in the 15 years since the early 2000, we can see how this cynicism spread. And it was spread from Kremlin, it was spread from the very top. And if the government produce the impression or deliberately propagate this cynicism, it spread everywhere. There is Mr. Putin, but also the whole group of people around him also. I can just guess. This is something probably with this background of KGB, the people who were trained to deceive or to use special operations instead of open politics. And this is how the Russian state is now works in many instances, how the special services usually does. And this is a part of the cynicism. And this is, from this point of view, I think that the next, any next president will be just forced to change this attitude, because I feel already that the people are very tired about this cynicism, are very upset about the spread of cynicism everywhere in the Russian state. I guess that there is somebody with a strong moral moral attitude can be very popular in today's Russia. It's just because of this cynicism. Somebody with a real moral stance, with real moral ground in Russia would be a popular leader. And I am sure that whoever will replace President Putin at whatever point, whatever year, he will play with at least play the person with a moral ground, or maybe be the person with better moral grounds. This is I think this is inevitable. It's not.
It is. All right. Professor, what do you think about, the leader that Putin is, I think, wouldn't mind being compared to as a strong leader is Joseph Stalin. Obviously, Joseph Stalin was, far more committed to terror than Putin appears to be. And that's not necessarily, that's a compliment to Putin. But Stalin's anniversary of his passing was just a few days ago. And he seems to be as much alive in Russian history and daily conversations in media as ever. Mm-hmm. Why?
Again, first, Stalin has already reappeared as the most important figure of Russian history of the 20th century. Why is another question. And the question, and I would try to answer that, the generation which actually remember Stalin and for whom the Stalin period was a part of their own lives are pretty senior people already. And for those who remember in personal experience, remember the Gulag or repressions are almost gone. This generation is so old already. And this is a moment always in history. This is a moment when the witnesses are gone. This is a period when the use of history appears, when the new generations who never lived under Stalin or under other regime, which is used, in our case, Stalin, the new generation begin to use this history for its own political or social purposes. And what do I mean when I say use? They just find one feature or one description or one projection of the very complex and difficult period of the Russian history, and take only one feature which they consider to be important, and they project it as a Stalin. If they say, okay, there was no corruption under Stalin, was it true? Yes, it was true, because partially because of Gulag, because of the communist system, because of many different reasons. But
well, because people were executed for petty theft.
People were executed, but the person who used this only one phrase, that there was no corruption under Stalin, he doesn't actually take any other features of those epoch, and he used it to criticize the current regime. Big portion of contemporary Stalinists in Russia are people critical to the current regime, because current regime is widely believed is very corrupt, and they use.
So it's like Putin wants to say that this suit fits me, of the next Stalin too, and the Stalinists are saying no, he was way more of a man than you will ever be.
Well, I would not say that Putin. Trying this Stalin suit, you will say that he is very cautious about that. He never praised Stalin. He condemned repressions under Stalin. He just hinted several times. He used one or another phrase of Stalin in his speeches, but that was enough for a Stalinist to say that Putin is, or even anti-Stalinist in Russia. It was enough for them to claim that Stalin is back. But if you look if you see or listen all the Putin's speeches, he never praised Stalin. He never said that Stalin was good. It was interesting. Last year, 2015, was very interesting from this point of view. We had several examples of erection of Stalin's monuments to Stalin in Russia, and that was for the first time since Khrushchev de-Stalinization campaign. First monuments to Stalin in more than 50 years. It was first in Yalta, Crimea, with this monument by Tsereteli to Big Three, to Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. But then it was Lipetsk, where the local communists erected a Stalin statue, and many others. And what followed that? In August of 2015, the government issued a decree to enforce the conception of memorialization of the victims of Stalinist repressions. So the government made a very clear signal that it's not happy about this re-Stalinization. And this was very interesting. So I would not say that Kremlin or government are happy with getting Stalin back. This is something strange because many people are considering that Russian state are moving into direction of Stalinism or returning to Stalin's Soviet Union. And actually, this widespread feelings was probably behind those erection of Stalin monument. I'm sure that it was a decision made on some level, middle level officials, bureaucrats, deputies, communist deputies, governors, but not on the top level, because for top level is not happy about re-Stalinization. While at the same time, yes, you're right that country more and more resembles at some of its points resembles the Stalinist Soviet Union, and especially in the foreign policy, which is actually was probably the major shift in the several years.
And the foreign policy, just briefly, are you speaking about the attempt, as was described by some as Yalta II, of redividing the world, how it was redivided by Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin after World War II, and this one more reset on a global scale where Russia is once again given its sphere of influence?
Yes, exactly. Everything started with at least it became visual since the annexation of Crimea, then events on the east of Ukraine, and all of that. Many Russian foreign policy analysts or foreign policy top diplomats, repeatedly say that we need some new redistribution. So they actually getting back to the language of the middle of the 20th century. They are getting and this is actually, but middle of the 20th century was a period when Russia was Stalin's Soviet Union, and that's why it was so. Interesting, we started our conversation with me saying that history is the best language the only available language for Russian politicians to speak about politics. And we can see how President Putin tried to invent another historical language to speak about the Crimea annexation. Do you remember when he late in November, I think, of 2014, started to speak about the sacred Khersones, He said that Crimea is a sacred place for Russians because Russian Prince Vladimir was baptized there in the 10th century AD. And
but somehow Russian Christianity traces its back now itself to Crimea.
And that was clear an example to suggest, to provide historical language to explain what happened in the year 2014. But of course, it was too far. And people in Russia probably just do not understand what Putin wanted to do. But on the other hand, the Stalinist explanation, this is, return to the 1945, return to the redistribution of world, was much more understandable, much more clearly, formulated, and that's why, the Russian discourse was getting back to Stalinist instead of getting back to Prince Vladimir of the 10th century. They're getting back to Stalin's middle of the 20th century, and that's why these monuments began to be erected in different parts of Russia, and that's why. Well, what happened with this re-Stalinization? But again, this signing of the concept of memorialization of the victims of Stalin regime was very clear message that Kremlin is not happy about that. So Stalinism in Russia is, on the one hand, it seems to be a representation of the current political discourse, but on the other hand, it's still critical to Putin, critical to regime, and it's to some extent it's oppositional to the regime. And this is this dichotomy. I don't know how to call it, this situation.
All right. Well, in conclusion, a couple of areas that I wanted just to, first of all, I wanted to touch on the situation with Nadezhda Savchenko. March 9th is supposed to be a World Awareness Day of her situation. If you wanted to kind of say a couple of words about her, that would be great.
Well, the whole situation with Nadezhda Savchenko is, to the best of my knowledge, I would say that there was from the very beginning an unlawful situation. It's a situation when, I'm not in a position to judge whether it was, the events that incriminated to her took place or not. But I see that there was a problem. She was she participated in the ranks of Ukrainian army against the insurrection, and she was taken in Ukrainian territory and transported to Russia. From the very beginning, the whole situation looked very, very in contradiction to any international or even Russian internal domestic law. And this is a very, strange and bad thing. And when Nadezhda Savchenko went into hunger strike, it became very dangerous it became dangerous for Russia, for Ukraine, for Russian-Ukrainian relations for many years to come. Because if Nadezhda would die in Russian prison, it will be, so bad event for both countries that I think that this would be the worst thing that it can happen in Russia today, in Russian politics today, or in Russian-Ukrainian.
Do you think that people of Russia will think any less or more of Vladimir Putin if Nadezhda Savchenko is released, or is it just a matter of the right headline being put in front of people on the nightly news?
It's hard for me to judge about the majority of Russian people. But there are many people who believes to what is said on the TV or in the news of TV. There are very many people. But on the other hand, whose opinions are important? The important are opinions of those people who can produce their own opinions, so-called Russian intelligentsia or intellectuals, or people who are, and this part of the society, which is a minority, of course, but this part of the society definitely follow what is going on with Nadezhda Savchenko, and this part of the society is very critical toward President Putin. And actually, this is a problem of the regime. The majority of the people support the regime, but the majority does not form their own opinion. They just follow the opinion of the TV. And that minority that form the opinion of their own, that minority is definitely very critical to President Putin, to the regime as a whole, and to the Russian policy in the Ukraine. And this is a problem for the regime, but this is also the source of the hope for Russia, I think, for the future.
All right. Professor Kurilla, the one question that I wanted to end with, and I guess one of the big reasons for doing this program is because I feel that what's going on in Russia is really such a good lesson for us here in the United States, but probably for other people in other countries as well. What lessons do you wish people from other countries would take away from what's going on in Russia?
You're getting me back to Chadaev. Do you remember that, Russian philosopher of the first third of the 19th century, who once wrote that Russia is the only Russian role in the world history is to give lessons to other countries what should not be done.
Well, and that's what this program is all about.
So. Yeah, it's Chadaev. It's, almost 2 centuries ago.
Yes.
And okay, still, I will start with saying that there are some lessons that other authoritarian regimes are taking from what Russia is doing. And if you see, like on Turkey, and we see how Erdogan is copying in some of his policy moves to what President Putin is doing. So there is a kind of authoritarian study, authoritarian learning from one authoritarian regime can be a model for others. And this is a bad side of all of this learning. On the other hand, Russia, if you want only the lessons which should not be repeated, or
well, if there's some good lessons, that's a good thing too. But it seems like they're harder to find.
I want to find good lessons, and the good lesson, okay. Let me not speak. Okay, I've told already about the bad lesson that authoritarians also, study the experience of each other, the achievements of each other. But I would also say that there is a lesson of, that people should be, I will start with my personal feelings that we now live in very hard, very difficult times from any point of view. From the point of view of the authoritarian, the regime became more and more authoritarian. We have the foreign wars Russia engaged in foreign wars. We have a deterioration of economic conditions on any scale. So we have very difficult situation. But on the other hand, I feel now a little bit better than I even felt during the so-called Putin's prosperity several years ago. Because now I understand that I am not alone. And this is very important to network, to know that there are people who think similarly or close to what you are thinking. It's very important to be on some side in the internal domestic political dispute. Several years ago, it was just unavailable for Russians because everybody was alone. There was a state machine, a state propaganda machine. And everybody who was in disagreement did not feel that he is a part of any part of the society. And what happened in 2011 and 2012, when people went to the streets in Moscow, Saint Petersburg, and other cities, they just understood that they are a minority, but they are a visual minority. There's a big minority. And this is the people who are. And since that time, since 2011 and 2012, it's getting a bit easier to survive, a bit easier to entertain hopes for the better future for Russia. And this is also the lesson. It's also the lesson to keep networking, to keep your political views not hidden somewhere, not taken at some to some black day in the future, but just to share it and find the people who thinking similarly. And this is a way to prevent some bad things to happen. You should organize. Of course, maybe it's not a lesson for Americans because they got all of those lessons back in the 18th century. But for Russians, I think for many other countries in the world, it's still very actual and very relevant advice. And I hope that this is something that we Russians also learned already and will know for the future.
Professor Kurilla, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you, Yuri, for inviting me.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, The Edge, WSUW in Whitewater, Wisconsin.